Before we get into this episode, it's worth saying that we recorded this conversation at the end of September 2023, so just before the 7th of October Hamas attack on Israel, from which the tragic consequences continue to unfold in Gaza. Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. On this episode of Sensing the Signal, I'm joined by Dr. Shay Hershkovitz, a leading expert in a range of different domains, including technology, intelligence and national security, and climate change. He is also the author of The Future of National Intelligence, How Emerging Technologies Reshape Intelligence Communities, which aligns very neatly with the focus areas of this podcast, namely technology, data and national security. Shay, you're almost the perfect guest for this podcast. So without putting too much pressure on the conversation, I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Very nice to be here, at least virtually, Terry, and thanks for having me today.
Thanks. And thanks for taking the time to join us. It's a continuation, really, I guess, of conversations we've had in the past. And it would be great to maybe get a little bit from yourself in terms of, just for our audience's benefit, some of your background, which is obviously very extensive, but please do pick out the things that are relevant and what you're currently working on, just to give people an idea of the areas that you've covered and your expertise, which I just wouldn't be able to do justice to.
Yeah, absolutely. So originally from Israel, started my career as most Israelis do when I joined the military at the age of 18. Right from the get-go, I joined the intelligence corps because of my fluency both in English, but more importantly in Arabic. And I spent almost 15 years working for the government in various capacities. And I would say that probably a little over half of my career working for the government, I worked as an analyst. Started right at the bottom and started climbing up the ladder. And that gave me a very good understanding as to intelligence role in decision making. So I worked closely with the upper political echelon and, of course, the military leadership and so forth, supporting their decision making. And that gave me a very unique perspective, mainly about what intelligence purpose is and what is good intelligence. So that was the first chapter of my career, if you will. At some point, I went academic, got my PhD in political science. And comparative politics was my topic. And aside of or along with my academic career, I started working as a consultant and as a market research expert. I did that for a little over a decade. And at some point, we relocated, me and my family, we relocated to the Bay Area in California. And that was the time when I joined the X Prize Foundation, which is a nonprofit that runs competitions. And that was the next chapter or the new chapter for me. I started working quite extensively on climate-related issues. And I actually used the skills that I have obtained working for the government basically to do research around climate technologies, climate needs, and so forth. These days, after working for several startups in the area of machine learning and AI and big data, these days I work with kind of the other side of the equation, mainly with investors, assisting them in identifying interesting and lucrative opportunities and investment opportunities. One might ask, what does it have to do with intelligence? So in my opinion, as I mentioned before, working as an analyst, I've gained the ability to very quickly digest large quantities of information and then turning that into something that people can actually use in the context of decision making.
That's really fascinating. I think especially bringing together those different areas of expertise that you've mentioned there. The thing that, as you said, cuts across them is how to bring together different types of information, vast quantities of information, even to make sense of it and come up with an answer and provide insight to people. And I think that's the essence of the challenge that obviously intelligence organizations and analysts deal with day in, day out. But I think that the way that the information landscape is changing, and this is obviously something you've addressed in your research as well, is making that more difficult in many ways, but because they're having to think of so many different ways of capturing information now, but also how do they organize themselves around that. And these are some of the things that I want to definitely get into in this discussion, because you cover such a variety of topics throughout your book. It's amazing actually the range that you've managed to pull together, but it's so interesting because they are so relevant to national security and intelligence and how that kind of work is done. And I wanted to maybe start from the beginning. So the kind of research question that you were trying to address was, in what ways will emerging technologies change the intelligence profession? What kind of led you to want to address that research question for the book?
So, people say that some people say that strategy is the story that you tell yourself in hindsight, basically to justify your actions. I wouldn't go that far, but the way I approached the research that ultimately led to writing the book wasn't as structured as we started off with, a research question, and then that basically guided the whole process. It was much more, I would say, arbitrary, in the sense that. So over the years, let's take a step back and set the context. So over the years, I was involved in dozens, if not more, studies around the future of. It was, the future of financing, the future of real estate, the future of consumer behavior, and so forth. So I was no alien to the concept of thinking creatively, but also systematically about the future. And again, these were not academic studies. It was basically studies that were created for decision makers, whether in the business sector or the government sector and so forth. But it has a very specific purpose, which was very practical. Fast forward, when I worked at the X Prize Foundation, I dealt quite a bit with futuristic thinking. And I've developed multiple methodological framework for discussing the future. And simultaneously, I was also involved in some academic activities and mainly around national security. And at some point, I had this aha moment. I started thinking, well, what is the future of intelligence, the profession of intelligence? And that kind of led me to a process which I started reading about the topic, and I sensed that when people talked about or wrote about the future of intelligence, their scope of analysis was somewhat limited in the sense that it was the past that kind of determined how they envisioned the future, rather than kind of divorcing from the past and try to think in a completely different way about the future of national security and the future of in intelligence specifically. Around that time, as part of my work for X Prize, I started experimenting with all kinds of advanced AI-based research tools. That was pre-ChatGPT and the like, a few years before that, actually. And there were a bunch of softwares and platforms out there that I was privileged to be able to experiment with. Being an analyst by training, I figured, well, using these software it's gonna revolutionize how intelligence analysts actually do their job. And so that kind of, all the topics that were in my head when I figured, okay, let's do that systematically. Let's sit and write down a research question and sub questions and so forth. And I was pretty aware of the literature Not that there was a whole lot of literature about the topic of the future of intelligence, but there was something to to work with. And I noticed certain trends or patterns. Patterns is a better word when describing how people talk about the future of intelligence. And I wanted to do something somewhat different. I'm now talking about the research method, if you will, without getting being too granular. And I noticed that most of what people wrote and the identity of the people writing about these topics, these people were rooted in the national security establishment. And I wanted to do something different. I wanted to write something from an entrepreneur point of view, if you will, from the market's point of view, from the tech industry's point of view, because one of my arguments in the book is that innovation in the field of intelligence actually comes from outside the intelligence circle. It comes from companies like Palantir, as an example, but startups and so forth. This is where true innovation comes from. And if you want to think about the really crazy stuff, of course, go look for the project that they have in DARPA and IARPA and so forth. They are working on futuristic
kind of cutting edge stuff.
Technologies. Yeah. So I wanted to the point of departure, if you will, was technology, and that basically kind of created the framework for the rest.
That's fascinating. I really want to dig into this. In particular, you talk there about the approach you took to think about not just, okay, what's already going on in the intelligence community and what they've been doing for a long time, which, it's the second oldest profession. So there's a lot of ingrained processes and ways of working within intelligence that don't change a lot over time, no matter what is going on around us. Even when there are reorganizations and new agencies created or new departments created in different places. But in essence, I think what's really fascinating there is that you decided to take a look at, right, how do other people approach this challenge of dealing with this modern information environment that we're in, getting on top of it and figuring out, okay, how do we make decisions using this information? And so what did you maybe get from exploring those different types of organizations and ways of working that informed your understanding of how intelligence not just could change, but perhaps needs to change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. Well, I think that we live in an age that everything around us basically is transforming. And that has tremendous implications on national intelligence. And it's also worth mentioning that for me, intelligence is not just something that, it's not a matter for spooks. It's not, of course, there's the James Bonds of the world. But for me, intelligence is basically
hopefully just in the movies.
Yeah, exactly. But for me, intelligence is the way that people develop knowledge for very practical purposes. And you can find intelligence in pretty much everything that we do, even if you plan a trip and you need to gather some information before, in order to book flights and so forth. So basically you're doing intelligence, right? You're gathering information, you're processing the information, you're trying to make sense and ultimately, make a decision and act upon this decision. And I've noticed that at least during the time that I did the research for the book, is that most people understand that this is a unique point in history where intelligence is going to take a new path. But what exactly is the nature of this change or the path or the transformation was somewhat ambiguous. And one of my objectives in this book was try to first to kind of put intelligence in an historic context. So, because one of the arguments was, well, there's nothing new here. We have experienced multiple technological revolutions. Maybe the pace of the revolution really intensifies. It becomes, you had the agricultural revolution, and then a few thousand years after that you had the industrial revolution, and then a few 100 years after that you had the information revolution, and so forth. And now it seems that every few years, if not every few months, there's a new revolution. But in essence, that's the nature of human progress, yeah, right? You move from the old to the new and so forth. But my argument was that this revolution is unique, and we need to think about it differently. And organizations need to understand that there's a gap between how they were initially established and organized, and the basic principles at least need to be revised, if not kind of redetermined or reinvented altogether. And I've seen that both in the national security establishment, by the way, not just in the U.S., which is the focal point of my analysis in the book, but also in the U.K., in Australia, so the Five Eyes, and same with Israel. But as I said, it's not just in the national intelligence establishment; it's also elsewhere in large companies. Also in academia. Remember, I have some academic affiliations, and I've been over the last 15 years I've been teaching quite extensively, and also academia is experiencing a major shift. And so this understanding or initial understanding or intuitive understanding that something has got to change, I think is common, but to what extent and how deep is it just an evolution or a revolution altogether? That was something that was still kind of debatable in the literature, 3, 4, 5 years back.
Interesting. But so effectively what we're talking about is the information landscape and the challenges that are involved in understanding what's happening in the world around us is the same for anybody who's doing any kind of knowledge work. But I guess when we're talking about intelligence and national intelligence in particular, the stakes are perhaps different, compared to, say, somebody working in the private sector or, academia. Not to say those things aren't important, but there's a certain element of trying to deal with greater risk, I suppose, and mitigate those risks in a lot of what people are trying to work on in national intelligence communities. You talk about emerging technologies and how those are playing a role. And as much as a lot of those historical precedents you mentioned involved other types of technological change or cultural change in the way that information spread, what do you think in terms of the emerging technologies that you cover a range of them in the book,
Yeah.
but it'd be great to get a sense from you of what are the ones that you think are the really critical ones that are going to make a big difference to the way that intelligence work happens, and the ones that we've got to really keep an eye on, and not even just keep an eye on, but also really start planning and thinking about how do we integrate those technologies or make use of them. And is that even possible currently, or what else needs to happen to make the most of those technologies?
Yeah. So in my book, I cover several key technologies, and obviously I made a decision not to include everything. Otherwise, I would have ended up writing an encyclopedia. Right.
Yeah, of course.
So I kind of identified several key technologies: AI, IoT, Internet of Things, 5G, and then blockchain, quantum computing, and also crowdsourcing, which is not really a technology, but it's closely related to IT technology, and it has major ramifications for intelligence agencies. And we can talk about it later. So determining which technology you want to focus on is really a matter of how deep into the future you wanna explore and plan. In the sense that if you can obviously work on the implications and applications of quantum computing for intelligence work, but realistically, I don't see a major breakthrough in that field in the next few years. If we really want to focus on technologies that are out there these days now, then I would say that there are two main key technologies that we should focus on. One is the Internet of Things, IoT, and the other one is artificial intelligence. And if we kind of discuss these technologies in the context of intelligence work, we can say that IoT is part of the data domain or in the information domain, basically sensors that allow you to collect more information, better information, much more granular and wider in terms of scope and even the quantity. In AI is, of course, it can be used to collect information better, but also to analyze the information. First to process the information and then to analyze it. So I would say that the main, at least in this point in time, IoT and artificial intelligence are the key technologies that we should focus on.
And with those two technologies, I mean, we hear a lot about artificial intelligence right now. Do you think that is becoming a sort of area that a lot of people are focusing on, and is going to grow much faster? And I guess we're hearing less about IoT right now. It was probably something we were hearing a lot about in the last couple of years, but I guess there's still been a lot of development in that area. We're probably just hearing less about it in the media, etc. But AI, especially with these large language models and the tools that have been built off the back of those, it feels like that's almost suddenly, in the last 18 months maybe, diffused to a large number of people who are suddenly using these kinds of tools. I mean, is that really what we're talking about when we talk about AI, firstly? And secondly, is that the kind of tool you're thinking about that is going to change the game for intelligence analysts? Or are we anticipating that something else is going to be coming in the near future when we talk about AI?
Yeah. So before I get to the AI bit, let me just say something about IoT and technological progress in general. There's also a certain hype around an emerging technology, and then
Yes.
the hype
Yeah.
kind of plateaus, and the technology becomes common. People just use it. So we all use IoT. If you have Alexa or Google Home, that's IoT, and for us, it looks pretty natural. I have little kids, and they are used to the fact that they can talk to objects, and the objects can respond, right? But for me, it's still exciting. I mean, I'm talking to a piece of plastic, and that's insane. But and of course, it's not just the devices themselves; it's also the meta information that you can obtain from these devices. So, for example, location and so forth. Even if you're not the user is not intended to actually reveal their location. Just one example about around IoT and why I think it's transforming the way we generate data information, and we can actually collect that. But I agree with you that AI is the real driving force of this transformation in this point in time. And let me say something about it. And you probably won't hear it too often from people who deal with the future. I'm not a futurist. I use kind of futurist methodologies, but I'm not a futurist. But I am proud to say that I was wrong in my book in one of my key projections, and that was around artificial intelligence. And I rather we focused on what I was wrong rather than what I was able to kind of anticipate correctly.
That is really interesting, because I was going to actually come on to ask you, what has changed. I mean, your book only is, it's very recent. It came out last year, and obviously I guess a lot's happened in the last 18 months, and you would have naturally completed a lot of the research for the book well before it was published as well. But
Yeah.
given what we've seen in the last 18 months, let's talk about that. What was wrong, and what do you think actually you would now look back on and say, okay, there's more there that we need to either dig into, or that has changed your perception of AI or any other aspects of what you covered in the book?
Yeah. So let's start with the book. Obviously, AI was probably the technology that that kind of stood at the heart of the book, right? And I've analyzed the potential uses, applications, and implications of using AI in the context of national security in general and in national intelligence in particular. And my argument was that using AI, we will be able to collect more and better information and do that seamlessly. And we will be able to also use AI tools to process the information. Then I argued that ultimately, making sense of this information is a matter for humans. As far as we know, we are still pretty far from obtaining or achieving artificial general intelligence. And there's no replacement yet to human cognition. And I argued that when it comes to creativity, reasoning, asking the right questions, and so forth, machines won't be able to replace us anytime soon. But as you just mentioned, the research for the book was done some 3-4 years ago, which is a lifetime in the context of technological developments. And the minute the book was published, it started to become less relevant. Again, it's part of the deal when you're writing something about futuristic or emerging technologies. By the way, I'm not saying that the book is outdated. I'm just saying that some of the technology really moves much faster than the publishers. But in any case, why was I surprised? Because a few months after the book was published, we noticed the LLM revolution, the large language model revolution. ChatGPT, of course, is the most is the known one, but then we had Bard, and we now have Claude, and we have tools all over the place that actually assist us not just in collecting information quicker, but also doing other more challenging cognitive tasks that up until, let's say, a year ago, nobody could have done without really putting some bright minds together. And I want to give you an example. This wasn't. It's not part of the book. It's a research I did about a year ago. About a year after publishing the book. So a couple of months ago. I assume that our listeners are familiar with the concept of structural analytic techniques, SATs. Which is basically a book of recipes on how to do intelligence analysis. Terry,
it's been around for a while,
that?
right? I mean, the last 20 years, but probably even more actually now, with some of those techniques. And they're well practiced, I would say, in the intelligence communities. I mean, there's a lot of discussion around those structural analytic techniques. So I'd love to, get into this example and hear what you found.
Yeah. So, on the one hand, it really puts some order in the process of analysis, and there's a suite of such methods, and people have been in the intelligence community, but also outside of the community, have been using structural analytic techniques for, as you said, Terry, about more than 2 decades now. And I figured at some point, a couple of months ago, what if we used AI basically to enhance the use of these techniques, because these techniques are very tedious. It takes a lot of time to follow the recipe, and some people are pretty skeptic about not only their utilization, but also whether they can actually create better insights or assist humans in creating better insights. And then I figured,
just on that point, I mean, I've probably spent a fair bit of time teaching those techniques to people over the last decade or so, and the thing that comes back from people is, well, it's interesting you choose the word tedious. One of the things that always comes back from people is, this is too time consuming, and I'm not convinced it's actually going to help me.
Yeah, absolutely. And being a part-time academic, I started with a thorough lit review, trying to analyze, to analyze what people are saying and writing about these techniques. And the common thread was that it takes too long, it's too cumbersome, and maybe it's good for academia, but for the real world where people are dealing with matters of life and death on a daily basis, these SATs they're not good enough. So, anyways, equipped with these insights, I've selected 10 techniques out of a list of, there are dozens of such techniques, but I selected 10. that kind of represent the families of techniques, because you have all kinds of groups of techniques, contrarian techniques, for example, techniques that should assist you in being more or thinking more creatively about the future, techniques that allow you to test your hypothesis and so forth. So I chose 10 of them that kind of demonstrate the potential, at least, of SATs. Now, for those of the listeners that have never seen a document that kind of describes these techniques, it's like a recipe. You start by doing this, you then do that, you then do that, and so on and so forth. Sometimes you have 5 phases or stages, sometimes you have 20, which is classic for prompt engineering, because basically what you can do is take every stage of the process and turn the instructions into a prompt. Now, it's not something that is easy to do. Sometimes you need to be very creative, but essentially you can translate these instructions into prompts. And I did just that. By the way, worth mentioning, I did that with my research assistant, Shoval, her name. And so we did that together. And to make a very long story short, the underlying argument or insight that stems from this study is that AI can actually help humans be more creative rather than just collecting information in a more efficient way. Because
because essentially you train the AI to do the stuff that is the tedious stuff effectively, the kind of steps that an analyst has to go through to marshal information, organize it, structure it, think through what it might mean. But essentially you're offloading that so that the human is free to do the rest, the creative thinking.
I think that tools like ChatGPT, they have two main advantages over humans. First is the extent of information or data that they were trained on, which is pretty much, one can argue, it's the entirety of human knowledge, right? And no expert could be expert on everything, right? So we always have certain limitations. And these limitations do not exist with large language models, unless we want to limit them for certain purposes. But, it's just a matter of storage and bandwidth and then training the algorithm. So that's one thing. Second, one of the things that intelligence professionals tell themselves that they need to do is put themselves in the mind or in the eyes of their opponent. In other words, if I really want to understand how Putin thinks, I should play Putin in a way, or try to think like Putin, and so forth. And that, to me, is a ridiculous claim, because even Putin doesn't know what he's going to do tomorrow, right? Let alone someone who sits 3,000 miles from Russia, and that person could be a Russia expert, but still, he's not Russian. He's not part of Putin's decision-making circles and so forth. So, but ChatGPT and large language models, well, they can't really become your adversary, but I think they have more flexibility in terms of trying to think the way your subject thinks, with a ton of caveats around it. And so when you ask ChatGPT, in the case of the study that I did on SATs, do a red team to try to counter my arguments, or play my adversary, or invent future scenarios that may or may not unfold, but you just use that as a tool to kind of enhance your thinking. That is amazing in terms of the output that the platform kind of spits out.
That is really interesting, because
it's not.
Yeah.
You have, even if you have 50% hallucinations, and an expert would say 50% of the output is irrelevant, you still have 50% that is genuinely interesting and genuinely challenging your the way you kind of think about your environment.
And that's what's really interesting there for me as well, is that what you're talking about is that you're not just getting the tool to do the boring, the kind of rote stuff, but actually the stuff that's almost too difficult, as you described, to ask a human analyst to do, especially on their own. You know, you might have a chance of doing that when you've got a group of people who can throw different ideas around, but it takes time. That takes a lot of time, and it may be unsuccessful. Whereas what you described there is that actually you can train it to better mimic the way that an adversary might think. Right? I mean, I've got that right.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
even if you put I both participated, managed, and designed war games throughout my career. I'm actually an expert on that field. And even if you bring a group of people to, let's say, you want to do a war game around, Iranian and Russian collaboration in the post-Ukraine war in Ukraine world.
Yep.
Ultimately, you basically bring people like yourself, right? People that were trained like you were trained, and they have the same cultural background and so forth. But if you do that with large language models that were trained on your relevant data, then I think the results, at least something to work with, are tremendously more novel in the way that kind of they present certain behaviors or how certain futures would unfold.
I think that's a really interesting example of a use for an LLM. And I recall you posted about this on LinkedIn as well, and so there are some details out there for anyone who wants to take a look and find out a bit more about the research that you did, right?
Yep, and we mentioned the slow pace in which academic journals and publishers move. So it will be published at some point in an academic journal, but I suspect that by the time it's going to be published, we're going to be in a whole new world of large language models and AI.
Well, I think it's in some ways it's kind of terrifying that you can create an LLM that will effectively, in some ways think like Putin.
Yeah.
Just that concept is terrifying.
They don't think like Putin, but
true,
they give you other perspectives that you can bake into your analysis.
Yeah.
And that's the point. We're not trying to mimic Putin. We're just trying to broaden our horizon in a way, and to be able to add more input to our analysis. Input that otherwise we won't have access to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. And if you tasked humans to do it, it would take a long time.
Yep. And it would take a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. I mean, just since we're talking about the Ukraine and Russia, is anything that's happened kind of changed your perspective or shifted your thinking on the kind of emerging technologies that we're seeing affecting intelligence? Whether it be things that it might affect intelligence work done outside of theatre, or whether it's affecting anything going on in terms of operations currently happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, the war in Ukraine is a really interesting case study from an intelligence point of view. And I think that most of my arguments and even predictions were demonstrated or proven to be correct in the war in Ukraine. I'll give you several examples. Let's start at a strategic level. I over the years I wrote quite extensively about the concept of early warning and not just analyzing past events, the Yom Kippur War as an example, and so forth, and Pearl Harbor, and other strategic surprises. But I was always kind of skeptic about intelligence or intelligence alleged mission, which is to provide early warning to for decision makers. I was a bit skeptic about it because I believe that nobody can really predict the future. I believe that people can shape the future, but that's a whole different ballgame. And when you try to predict the future, you come to realize that almost every time intelligence organizations worldwide have failed to predict the future, right? The history of the intelligence establishment is peppered with failures. And obviously you hear about the failures, you don't hear about successes, but at a very strategic level, I'm not talking about the tactical level, whether a certain terrorist is in that building or not. I'm talking about the strategic level. Is Putin going to invade Ukraine? And if he does, will he succeed or not? So in almost every step throughout the modern history of intelligence organizations have failed to anticipate or to predict the future.
Yeah,
And
I think when that anticipation does happen, I mean, to make it more accurate and to get it to a point where, they can say, okay, yeah, well, we accurately predicted what was going to happen. It ends up being done very close to the event happening, rather than far enough away that you can actually plan for it and prepare.
Exactly. And I think the one of the arguments in the book is that we need to have a new framework for the intelligence and decision maker nexus, and determining whether intelligence did its job correctly or not shouldn't be about whether it was able to predict a certain event or not, rather than did they equip the decision maker with the right information and knowledge that allowed them, the decision makers, to make decisions correctly. So the criteria should be much more programmatic than whether I was right or wrong. Now, if you look at the war in Ukraine, you can actually see that the entire concept of early warning pretty much collapsed. Early warning, prediction, forecast. There are many names to call that, but and it collapsed on both sides. It collapsed on the west side that wasn't able to really anticipate the invasion and the magnitude and the commitment of the Russians to the war. But also on the Russian side, we don't know much about Putin's inner circle, but we do know that they didn't think that they're gonna be, it's gonna be a long war. It's gonna take a heavy toll. They actually thought, we'll start a war like the invasion to Crimea.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be quick and easy.
Exactly, and both sides were wrong, which basically demonstrate the limitations of forecasting and prediction and early warning and such. So
but on the Western side, though, I mean, the US government did use some intelligence which they put into the public domain to say, look, we think Russia is about to invade, but do you think that was all? I mean, well, partly that was obviously to try and influence and convince Ukraine that this was going to happen, and it felt like at the time the Ukrainian government weren't necessarily that convinced of that argument, but there were certainly mixed signals from different countries in Europe, and it was a confused picture, I guess, if you looked at it across the board. But even then, I guess some of the warnings that came were very close to the event.
Absolutely. I think one of the limitations of early warning is, and also the limitations of intelligence, is that even if intelligence gives an early warning enough time ahead of the event, it really is a matter of the decision maker, right? It's a matter of decision whether I want to act upon this early warning or not. And you can have the best intelligence out there, but if the decision is made incorrectly, then the intelligence becomes less relevant. And we see time and time again when we analyze strategic surprises, almost every time there was no shortage of good and deep intelligence. Not in Pearl Harbor, not in 9/11, not in the before the Yom Kippur War, and so on and so forth. And I think that even if certain countries in the West did have some good intelligence about Russia's intentions, the fact that nobody really acted as a result of this, let's call it early warning, is a demonstration that another demonstration of the limitations of the concept of early warning, not from an intelligence point of view, but from a national security point of view, which is much wider than just, that's the role of intelligence and that's it. Now, and that brings another point here, which is the importance of, let's call it open intelligence, which is a key argument in my book. I argue that if intelligence organizations want to be relevant, they need to redefine how they work with the public. And the public is, it could be companies, it could be the general public, it could be decision makers, and so on and so forth. But the days where, there was a certain curtain behind intelligence work, these days are long gone. Intelligence need to be much more transparent, not because it's the right thing to do and because of avoiding misuse of the power that intelligence organizations have, and that's a very important cause of itself. But if intelligence wants to do its job better and to influence decision makers and to be more relevant, they need to work in a much more transparent way. They need to be able to kind of show, like they did before the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, they need to use intelligence products to influence opinions and so forth, and to push certain activities. And so I think the war in Ukraine, the way that open source intelligence was used, and by open source, by the way, I also mean commercial intelligence was used, has demonstrated its potential, because people basically used cheap, high quality information or data or information that was produced by ordinary people. And stuff that was posted on social media was used basically as part of the activities in the field. So I think
and you have the combination of commercial satellite imagery and all these other resources that you can bring to bear. To your point, I mean, there is so much more now that can be put out into the public domain, but also can then be evidence, that people can actually look at it and question it and say, well, let's have a look and see, where is this information coming from? Do we trust it? How do we know this? Much easier to do now probably than in any time in the past.
Absolutely. And I describe in the book, in other publications, I described a new concept dubbed cross-int. So crowdsource intelligence. Everything is int, right? Human and SIGINT and so forth. So cross-int, which is more of a conceptual framework rather than a collection discipline. It's basically the fact that intelligence organizations can actually use the crowd to perform all kinds of tasks that previously were confined to the intelligence professionals, and we can see that in various cases. Some of them are related to national security. We've seen that in the case of the war in Ukraine, but we also see that elsewhere. I do a lot of work in the climate domain, and crowdsourcing is a pretty common practice when you try to kind of monitor illegal logging, for example, in remote places and so forth. So I see a lot of potential of bringing the crowd into the intelligence work. And I think it serves both sides, because obviously it serves the intelligence organizations because they get labor for free, if you will. But also I think it is important for the population itself, or for the citizen themselves, to actively contribute to national security efforts and really understand what's the problem there. And we've seen all kinds of interesting programs around that. So, there's a great book which I highly recommend reading called Super Forecasters. Basically about how you can use ordinary people, like me and you, who are not part of part of the inner circles of intelligence, basically to do intelligence work. And more often than not, ordinary people, can predict or can discuss the future in a much more accurate and creative way than intelligence professionals who are limited by, a whole suite of constraints.
Yeah. I mean, that's really fascinating. I mean, when it comes to crowdsourced intelligence or crowdsourced information, I think we've seen examples of that in Ukraine as well, where they created a platform where people could take pictures of what the Russians were doing as they invaded and share that with the authorities in Ukraine. Are there some risks there, though, with that type of crowdsourcing, where it could either be manipulated on the one hand,
Mhm.
on the other hand,
Right.
potentially, you mentioned there the example of illegal logging. For those people who are monitoring it and becoming the sensors and then passing on the information that they see or hear, is that putting them at risk potentially?
Absolutely, it could be easily become a double-edged sword. But and I don't think that there were some experiments with crowdsourcing in the past. Um, some of them were more successful, some of them were less so. But I think we're only starting to scratch the surface in terms of the potential. And this is something that agencies need to consider, and they have to use that as part of their day-to-day job. I think it's a force multiplier. Again, it comes with risks, but everything comes with risks, right?
Right.
The old
Hmm.
methods, the new methods, we have to be cognizant of those risks and tackle them right from the get-go.
Really interesting. So, crowdsourcing information was one of the things that you touched on that is becoming really important. Potentially, it has the potential to become really important and could be really valuable for intelligence agencies if they're if they're more open to, I guess, sharing requirements and talking about what their priorities are and the things that they're interested in, right? I mean, that's how you're going to generate that information coming in. Is there, I mean, this is one of the aspects, obviously, that you covered in the book, but also it's one of those things that drives potential organizational change, which, from what you've talked about here, and you described how this is something that it's still not really been tested, it's not been fully explored. For intelligence agencies and organizations, anyone involved in that field, does this involve a type of change to the way that they operate, the way that they work, the way that they structure themselves as well, to be able to use those capabilities, not just crowdsourcing, but even some of the technologies that you talked about? So making better use of LLMs or information that they're able to pull together from outside, and even in the example you talked about where you can use it for applying structured analytical techniques in a different way. Just what does that entail? Because I think one of the things that I've found often is with especially with government agencies, intelligence work, whether it's in the military or civilian agencies, or even with corporate organizations, private sector organizations where they are involved in intelligence work, often the same doctrine, the same principles, the same methods are applied, and those can sometimes be quite rigid and quite static, and not necessarily open to change or innovation or doing things differently. And maybe going back to what we started off discussing, where you looked at approaches from other fields to think about how intelligence could be done better. When we talk about crowdsourcing, LLMs, other tools, are these drivers of change that are going to result in the type of change that these organizations maybe need to go through to make them better and more effective?
Yeah, I think an important question, and generally speaking, people don't like changes. Organizations
Mm-hmm.
don't like changes,
Mm.
and governments don't like changes. So, and these are large organizations. It's like every substantial change, it takes a lot of time to execute. And I think the very first step is realizing that a change is needed, that there is a gap between how the organization is built, what are its outputs and so forth, and what reality actually forces us to do. So acknowledging that there is a problem, then there is a gap, is the very first step. Now, since I wrote I worked on the research, and all the way until now, I've seen how the discourse has changed. 7 years ago, there were there were kind of two camps, if you will. Those who advocated for a change and those who actually rejected change or were much more cautious, which I think is important, by the way. Now you can actually see that the realization of that intelligence needs to change radically not just modify itself, but change altogether, has become the mainstream, and that's good because I think that's the very first step. Now, but it's just the first step, because these are complex organizations, and to add to the complexities, you have two other constraints, in my opinion. There are a bunch of constraints, but two constraints that I think rise above the others. One is intelligence professionals' addiction to the concept of the intelligence cycle. And the other one, I knew that that you like it. And the other one is, which is related, is a cultural and generational change. Maybe we can start with the latter and then dive into the former, because the former is a much heavier and bigger topic to discuss. But I have no doubt that once Gen Y and Gen Z and Gen Alpha will be the majority in these organizations, especially the leadership positions, these organizations are gonna change themselves from the ground up. They're gonna adopt. It's not a matter of adopting new technologies. These technologies are gonna be part of how they do what they do. So people like me and like you, Terry, without disclosing our age, we remember how things used to be in the good old times, right? You would lock yourself in a room with books and a notebook, and you would read and write, and that's pretty much it. But when I'm looking at my kids, they sit on their desks with several screens, and they use all kinds of tools, and they are native to these new technologies. Same thing will happen with intelligence organizations sooner rather than later, I think, because millennials are becoming more senior, and Gen Z. That's the next generation, and Gen Alpha is the generation after that. So that's on the from a cultural perspective. But I think the main thing here, one of the main things, is we have to talk about the intelligence cycle and why, until let's say pretty much the 90s, it was a powerful concept that really organized the intelligence apparatus around a certain idea. But since the 90s, and obviously it doesn't happen in a day. It takes time, it takes years. But this concept has become obsolete. The fact that people are still clinging to it, still describing intelligence work as a cycle, I think, to me, it really prevents them from thinking creatively and much more accurately about how intelligence should behave, should structure, what is its output, how it corresponds with decision making, and so forth. So we have to get rid of that concept, which was powerful, but currently it's only limiting our thinking.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think that, well, for anyone who's not familiar with the intelligence cycle, what we're talking about really is a fairly mechanistic model of going from what's normally termed direction, so some sort of question or requirement that analysts are working on, through phases like information collection, analyzing that information, creating some sort of product, passing it back to whoever's provided the direction for feedback, and then you go around again and again.
Yep.
And it's almost like a static. Well, it's normally depicted in a very simplistic way when you see it graphically envisioned. But I think that's because these are all steps that everyone works through when you're producing analysis, but they don't necessarily happen in that kind of step-by-step fashion. And it starts to break down once you have multiple people doing things all together. And and I'm sure you have as well. We've seen organizations build themselves around this model where you will have teams that are focused on collection, teams that are focused on analysis, and teams that are focused on production. And in my mind, that doesn't really work. It's trying to apply almost like a sort of factory production line way of thinking to producing intelligence, and it doesn't really work, especially in this modern era. I don't think it's worked for a long while, to be honest, but I think especially now, where we need probably something that's more a systems thinking approach to intelligence rather than that kind of mechanistic model. And yeah, exactly what you've described there. I think it's something it's so pervasive that I see it a lot, even with organizations I work with outside of government, outside of national security, where you may have a lot of former professionals, intelligence professionals from those fields, who are tasked to come out and do intelligence in a different environment, but bring with them some of the old models and theories and try and apply them in a different context, where I think it becomes even harder to probably make that sort of model work. And yeah, I think you're exactly right that there's a generational element to it as well, where the younger generations are probably happier to push back and say, well, wait, this doesn't make any sense, or this doesn't really work for us. It's just slowing us down, which is completely valid. I think it was probably slowing people down in the past, but it was harder to maybe make those changes. Whereas now, like you said, we've reached probably or maybe we've crossed over that tipping point where the information environment and the way that it is, and the nature of the challenges and the threats that we're dealing with, mean that you can't work at the pace of that old model.
Yep.
You've got to be able to produce things faster, and you've got to go from sensing something happening to informing a decision maker much more rapidly and getting feedback, I think.
Yeah, I think that you've captured that correctly. I think it's this is an assembly line like concept, one directional, right? You start, as you said, you start with collection, then you move to the other phases. And that was good when it was initially created, the concept by Sherman Kent back in the late 40s, and all the way through the Cold War, where the world was pretty much stable. But in this day and age, with the current technologies, with the current threats and so forth, and also the expectations of decision makers from their intelligence organizations and the expectations of the public and their willingness to work, the willingness of, let's say, companies to work with intelligence and so on and so forth, that really makes the concept of intelligence cycle as a notion obsolete. It's no longer relevant. And I want to give you just one example. Take, for example, the intelligence work in the cybersecurity, in the cyber domain. Okay, so when you penetrate a certain system, is that collection or not? Because you can penetrate a system and you can just stay dormant there, and you don't have to collect anything. Can you really penetrate a system without doing some research before that? Can you research the system without collecting information? And what about the fact that, too many people claim that intelligence should keep itself clear from action. Lots of people, experts, argue that intelligence is all about describing reality. They don't do anything. They don't do anything operational in the environment. This is a matter of the operation units and operational units and so forth. Well, I argue that it's just incorrect, because again, if you're penetrating a system, then you're actually doing something in the world. You can't really distinguish collection from operations, from research, and so forth. So that's just one example. If you look at big data, the intelligence cycle assumes that you, the intelligence professional, you have to come up with your, let's call it the research question, the brief, right?
Yeah.
And you get this brief from your commanders, and they get theirs from the decision maker, and so on and so forth. But in any case, it's linear. It's very high. There's a certain hierarchy behind that. But what happens when you have an ocean of information, and you can actually use machines, AI in our case, to surface the questions? So you can just ask the machine, show me a certain anomaly, right? You don't know what the anomaly is. You don't know what you're looking at. But the machine could surface patterns, correlations, anomalies, and so forth. And that really determines the research question, if you will. And going back to IoT, information in this day and age, and I talk about it in my book quite a bit, is collected and stored in unimaginable quantities compared to the past. So we can actually collect, a lot of information without having a real research question in mind. And then we get to this information, we get to analyzing this information once a certain need arises, whether it arises by humans, let's say the decision maker is interested in doing something, or by the machines that were able to identify interesting patterns.
Just thinking about the different generations that we talked about. We talked about millennials, Gen Z, the alpha generation that are coming. They're obviously going to be doing things very differently. They are growing up in a different environment. We've talked about their adoption of technology at a much earlier age and their ability to maybe synthesize and condense information in different ways than certainly I grew up being able to do. What, though, do you think might be potentially lost in terms of the kind of more old school, let's say, approaches that you and I might have to conducting intelligence work compared to maybe some of the younger generations and how they go about it? Is there something there that intelligence agencies need to retain in terms of their current working methods and the approaches that they've taken in the past?
I think that's an important question. If there's one thing that concerns me with the current technologies is that it gives us the opportunity to make shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts, and taking the ChatGPT's output as an example, as is, or relying on it, could be devastating because it has a lot of problems. And maybe the biggest problem is that it lacks any context. Because when I ask ChatGPT a question, the tool doesn't really know why I'm asking the question and to what end, and who benefits, who benefits from my analysis. But if I will rely solely on the output, that to me is a shortcut. Yeah, I'll be able to generate intelligence analysis much faster. Question is it going to be better? And if there's one thing that we need to keep as part of the DNA of an intelligence professional is the domain expertise. And it comes with a lot of, it comes with a big baggage. Being an expert in something takes years. I don't think that people can't be experts in a year and not in 5 years even. And there's a certain price you have to pay, right, to become an expert. And at least now, for now, I don't see any AI-based tools that can actually do or help me gain this expertise or to replace the fact that I'm an expert, right? And so this is something we have to keep in mind, that on the one hand, we have to train our analysts to be able to use these tools as part of their day-to-day job. But on the one hand, we need to insist that our analysts are intellectuals, and being an intellectual means that you are curious, that you never take anything for granted, and this is basically what lead you to becoming an expert in a field. So this is something that we have to keep.
Yeah, I guess it's that combination, the classic combination of specialists or domain experts and people who are maybe more generalists who can work together essentially to maybe get that combination of speed, but also reviewing outputs and saying, well, actually, this is wrong because of X, Y, Z, and I happen to know that because I've been working on this for so many years. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's
but
that's
even
really
even a generalist, they are experts in being able to generalize things, right?
That's
and
true.
I've never seen a generalist
Yeah.
who's not an expert on something, right? Who hasn't dedicated years, if not decades, to studying various fields. But a generalist is an expert. So yeah, and you can argue that LLMs are generalists, but again, they lack the context, and the context is crucial if you are an expert in something.
And I guess we could also potentially see more. Well, we are already probably seeing more special. Let's say rather than specialist, maybe specialized. So narrowly defined LLMs looking at particular topics rather than
Right.
across the whole field of information. So yeah, I guess there is that element still there. But yeah, you're exactly right. I think every generalist brings that kind of critical
Yeah,
thinking element
exactly.
to it still, and that's what the traditional, I guess, approach to intelligence involved. Really, it's critical thinking. It's being able to figure out logically what might be happening, but based on that ability to contextualize and say, well, actually, it's because of this, and we happen to know that through the work we've done previously or knowledge we've acquired, etc. Yeah, that's a really, really important point. Just coming back to one of the things you mentioned earlier, where you talked about the intelligence agencies needing to kind of compete for attention and competing with organizations outside of government and what have you. I mean, I think that's become a really interesting dynamic in the last couple of years, in particular, where they are having to compete. You know, everyone's
Yep.
competing for attention somehow, but the intelligence agencies are really competing for the attention of decision makers with organizations that are outside of the intelligence community, who are analyzing and understanding what's going on. They're not perhaps hidebound by those old mechanistic models, but are actually just responding to the information around them and asking interesting questions and then going off and trying to answer them in a way that is perhaps more flexible, more agile, and they're able to produce really interesting insight on a quicker time frame in ways that government agencies aren't able to do. Are there still kind of those barriers to crossing over that threshold to where that type of technology, that type of approach and reorganization, transformation is how you term it in the book, that kind of transformation of intelligence, is that still stuck somewhere, or do you think that it's happening but just maybe slowly?
Well, I think it's happening, but slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are several barriers that really prevents us from achieving this transformation. And as I mentioned before, these processes, it takes a lot of time. It takes years, and I don't think it would be responsible to do these changes quickly, because as you
Mm-hmm.
said, it's a matter of life and death, and we have to be, we've built something over the last almost 100 years now, right? Modern
Yeah.
intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
and changes cannot really happen in a day.
Mm-hmm.
So cautious, we have to be very cautious about it. Having said that, I do think there are certain barriers. For example, just to state a few, and I talk about it in my book quite a bit. First, I think there's false expectations. Decision makers, some of them, not all of them, they don't really know what they can ask their intelligence organizations to produce and what they can't. So sometimes they would say, I want AI to prevent a war, right? Which is clearly, it's just no machine can do that, at least for now. Um, or they don't know what they can ask in their organizations to do. So that's one problem. The other
Mm-hmm.
problem is that false promises. So you have false expectations, and then you have false promises. Intelligence organizations argue, all of them around the world, we can, not in these words, but we can predict the future. In the sense of our main mission is early warning and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can predict the future. No, unless someone comes up with a crystal ball, and maybe someone, DARPA is currently working on it. But it's just impossible to predict the future. But in an additional argument would be, and I've seen that in the Israeli case time and time again, usually after big intelligence failures. Well, we can predict the future. We just need more sensors. We need more information. More sensors, more information equals to more money. Give us more money, we'll be able to better predict the future. Which is,
Mm-hmm.
to me, is completely nonsense. It comes from, it's from the realm of politics, of organizational politics, rather than from the world of truly understand what intelligence is. So these are two big barriers that I see, that prevent from this transformation to happen. And another thing worth mentioning, and you've discussed that, Terry, is the fact that intelligence now has unprecedented competition.
Mm.
There's a famous quote by the late Shimon Peres, Israel's prime minister and then president. And he said that back in the 80s, I think. He said, I don't read intelligence reports. I read The Economist, I read the New York Times, and I get everything that I need from these media outlets.
Hmm.
And when people ask him why, he said, well, first, it's much more thorough. And second, by the time that I get your analysis, it's already in the newspapers. And so, even though it's somewhat of a radical argument, we had here in the U.S. a president that pretty much, saw the intelligence establishment as irrelevant, and pretty much ignored intelligence, early warning and analysis and so forth. Now, I'm not justifying President Trump at all. I think it was devastating. Not just for the national intelligence establishment, but also for the American, for America as a country.
Yeah.
But if there's one lesson that we have to take from these 4 years, is that there is indeed a competition, and you have prominent outlets that do tremendous analysis, tremendous work in terms of analyzing and revealing secrets and all of that. And you have private companies that nowadays can offer a wide array of services that up until, let's say, a decade ago, were just within the realm of the government. And so intelligence organizations need to kind of find their claim to fame, find their competitive edge, try to really understand what they can do that nobody else can, right? And how they can collaborate with all these technologies and so forth that are out there.
Yeah, because I guess even aside from the things that they can do, they've also got to be thinking about we're having to keep on top of all the things that others can do, so that they're not missing things and they're not behind they're not behind the news cycle ultimately. I mean, that's probably the worst place for an intelligence agency to be, is
Right.
to be, gathering all their information just by reading the morning papers. But, I think it's really, it's interesting what you mentioned there. You obviously touch on various different aspects of those organizational transformation issues and blockers. But in terms of one of the drivers maybe that is kind of forcing the intelligence community to change the way it works, it'd be great to get your thoughts, just because I know this is a really big area of expertise for you and it's where you're currently working. But how is the way that governments are having to respond to climate change, how is that perhaps also changing or should we expect it to change the work of intelligence agencies?
Absolutely, Terry. I think climate change is humanity's biggest, should be humanity's biggest concern. It affects everyone. It has no borders. The question whether it's reversible or not, or could be stopped or not, is highly debatable. And in any case, yes, we have to prevent global warming and so forth, but we also need to prepare to life in a world that pretty much looks and feels completely different than what we used to know so far. And I've dedicated decades of my life analyzing the Middle East, and the Middle East is a very good example for how climate change and climate trends could ultimately affect national security, and for this reason, national intelligence organizations have to take into account climate change and develop expertise in that field. And so, just a couple of random examples. If you have less available water, that leads to wars, right? That leads to migration. That leads to more conflicts. That leads to urbanization. All these trends basically affect the stability of the region, the stability of certain regimes, the relations between countries. Let's say, following the war in Syria. So there are arguments that the civil war in Syria, post Arab Spring, was among other factors was caused because of the a growing process of desertification
Yeah.
in Syria and Iraq and Jordan. And we all saw, whether it's true or not, it's just an example of how climate change could and would affect, the geopolitical theater, if you will. Now, if you are an organization, an intelligence organization, right, you have to take that into account. And the problem or the challenge with this big topic of climate change is that it really involves various types of knowledge, various types of expertise, and you have to bake them all together if you really want to have a meaningful analysis, something that people can actually act upon. I remember reading, that was a year and a half ago, I think, one of the National Intelligence Council's, the U.S. National Intelligence Council's report on climate change. And I was so surprised to see how superficial it was. And I know for a fact that there's a lot of work done, kind of behind closed doors. But reading such a strategic overview and prediction from such a respectable organization really shows, maybe really demonstrates the gaps. And as someone who's deeply involved in the science of climate change, thinking about the future as a given, for example, right, which is something that no serious climate scientist would support. It's a matter of probability and a lot of moving parts, and then analyzing the outcomes, the potential outcomes of global warming. It's not a given. There's no one path to the future, and when you discuss that, in a non-scientific way, I think you're missing out on too many things that are crucial for the decision makers to consider. And so, and also that's on the grand strategic level. Also on the operational level, climate change is gonna affect and already is affecting supply chains. Mm-hmm. Think about God forbid another war in the desert. Mm-hmm. You would have 60 degrees Celsius, pretty much melting all the sensitive equipment that you have. The mm-hmm. computers, the drones, everything, right? And that's not science fiction. So intelligence organizations definitely need to take into consideration climate change itself, and then its secondary and tertiary effect, and how it's going to impact the ability of the military to deploy and to operate its force. How on the strategic level it's going to affect how countries engage with one another, the war on scarce resources, and a bunch of other topics. But that to me is the main topic that intelligence organizations need to develop deep expertise in.
That's really interesting, and I think that's something we'll hopefully hear a lot more about, and start to see it become more of a national security priority in more countries, because I think once it crosses into the national security theatre, then suddenly it becomes an urgent issue. And I mean, obviously it is an urgent issue. It's an urgent issue for everybody, but I'm not sure that policymakers and decision makers in every country and every government necessarily treat it with the urgency that they ought to. And by making it a national security issue, suddenly you're throwing resources at it that are geared for dealing with things that are much more immediate threats to the safety and security of people. And so hopefully that might change the way that we end up responding to climate change, or the way that we organize ourselves throughout society. But is that climate change threat, is that driving any technological change that you're also seeing in terms of emerging technologies to sense where climate change may be most acute, and to sort of see if it's able to give us a way to see those primary, secondary, tertiary effects in advance. I mean, I know we've talked about not being able to predict the future, but being able to sense what's going on around us obviously is a vital part of intelligence.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about working with climate investors is that you get a chance to be exposed to all kinds of cutting edge technologies, and I see time and time again the concept of dual use mentioned. There are so many technologies in the climate domain that could be used for national security purposes and vice versa. Unfortunately, I still don't see these two areas exchange, technologies and ideas in a way I think they should. But absolutely, I think that you can really empower national security technology and intelligence technology with inventions coming from the climate domain, if you will. But again, it also goes the other way. For example, if you use satellites, which is the intelligence establishment has used that since the 50s. This is a core technology that is being used to tackle climate change. So that's just one almost obvious example, but there are bunch of other much more sophisticated and advanced technologies that could be used for both purposes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that maybe gives us a little glimmer of hope, maybe that that this the situation might improve and we'll start to see more action taken. I mean, this has been a really fascinating discussion, Shay, and I know you and I could talk about these issues all day long. But
absolutely.
This has been great to talk to you and get some of your thoughts on not just what's been happening up to now and some of the research that you've done in the past, but also what you're thinking about in terms of what might come next. And it's been great to have you on the podcast and great to share your time and your thoughts and ideas with our audience.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for having me. It was a great conversation, and I'm sure that we will continue that.
I hope so. The world is changing rapidly. Can intelligence agencies keep up? The technological and generational shifts that Shay described will have huge consequences for intelligence agencies everywhere. Not only do they need to adopt new technology and data sets, but also change their mindsets and cultures around what intelligence is, how it functions as a system. There will be huge competitive advantage for those who can adapt faster, especially if they can transform more proactively rather than reacting to external changes later. And for those organisations that don't manage this, I think they'll increasingly seem obsolete in the eyes of decision makers and irrelevant to the public they aim to protect.
Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.